Hi everybody, welcome to another edition of The Debate on Press TV. I'm your host, Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus. Another blame game by President Donald Trump. The U.S. has threatened to pull out of the World Health Organization, which it blames for a very sad job as regards the COVID-19 pandemic. China argues that the U.S. is shifting the blame on others for its own mishandling of the crisis. This while WHO member states have agreed on an independent review of the global pandemic response. Now, what's pushing President Trump to ignore his administration's inadequate response to the pandemic and point fingers at others? Doesn't he need this to win a re-election? Now, let's go to Beijing to our correspondent, Stephen Ribe, to hear the Chinese side of the story. Stephen.
Well, it's exactly like you say, actually. I speak to people within the Chinese foreign policy community, particularly within the Chinese Foreign Ministry, and they are acutely aware of how the US system works and what Trump needs to do and say in order to win elections. To begin with, they know that Trump takes money from the big pharma industry, the US pharmaceutical industry, is a big source of his campaign finance. So, for example, the US disassociating itself from the WHO resolution on COVID-19, in which it calls for the sharing of resources. He knows that America is disassociating itself from that and protecting intellectual property and reserving its right not to share its vaccines with the third world for free. He knows that that's a result of Trump taking money from big pharma to win his elections. He also knows that another big constituency of Trump's is the anti-abortionist Christians, who are very, very reliable voters and will take issue with any president who is in favor of abortion. So he knows that the Chinese commentators and the analysts know that the US disassociating itself with the resolution wording on reproductive health is as a result of Trump's need to win votes from the anti-abortion Christian constituency.
Mm-hmm.
More generally, they are aware that Trump withholding funding and threatening to withdraw from the WHO is part of a pattern of withdrawing from international organizations, and that this feeds into his narrative that he has adopted to win the votes of the dispossessed in America, that the reason for the worsening of their circumstances is that America, under former leaders, has been weak in being too generous and letting other countries, particularly China, take advantage of it, and that this weakness will end under Trump, thus reversing America's decline. More importantly, they know that Trump's blaming of the WHO in China for the pandemic serves to draw public attention in America away from the complete mess that the US is in now due to Trump's indecision and lack of a unified and strong policy against the virus. As you well know, China has had single-digit cases every day for the past 6 weeks. America has over 20,000 new cases every day. It's a complete contrast. They know that Trump's position, because of all these factors, may favor Trump in that it helps him win elections, but it disadvantages America because it makes him adopt policies and take a stance that disadvantages America.
Okay.
They know that Trump's position of withdrawal from the WHO is giving China an opportunity to step forward as leader, take Americans' place, and turn around, quite honestly, what should have been a disaster for China, because as you know, this virus comes from China, so this should be a disaster, but it's looking like China is now turning the tables.
All right. Okay, Stephen, I got to jump in. That's all the time we have for this segment. Thank you very much for that. Stephen Ribe, correspondent live for us from Beijing. Now, joining me in this debate will be Professor with the University of Shizuoka, Takeshita Seijiro, who's joining us from Shizuoka, and also investigative journalist Tony Gosling from Bristol. Let's start with Takeshita Seijiro. Some observers argue that President Trump is stepping up the blame game and threats against China and the WHO because he needs a scapegoat to win re-election in November. Are they in the right, in your opinion?
Well, it's yes and no. The reason for my saying this is that, firstly, I don't disagree with many of the accusations and criticism of, Mr. Trump. And it's 3:40 a.m. here in Japan, but I can talk to 3:40 p.m. in Japan if I wanted to continuously talk about the credibility or lack of it by Mr. Trump and his methodologies to basically corrupt or destroy the international alliance that has been built over the decades. I think, for example, Iran is probably one of the countries that understands this very, very acutely, while Mr. Trump was trying to truncate and unfortunately successfully done so, the peace treaty with the Europeans and the Iranians, and all these issues by basically bullying tactics that he adopted. So, I don't disagree with your correspondence, but here, in this case, things are quite different. The focal point is on WHO, which should be tackling this worldwide pandemic with all the resources it has on a very fair basis. There is absolutely not a scintilla of doubt that WHO, especially Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, who is the General Secretary, who is extremely skewed, who's clearly heavily influenced by the Chinese Communist Party. It's not only, in fact, Mr. Trump, but it's Australia, India, Indonesia, Italy, Japan. All these countries are imposing quite a lot of questionnaire to this country. Australia, for a good example, being the spearhead of asking Chinese to have an independent inquiry. And there's not, again, a scintilla of doubt that their decision-making process is extremely skewed and thus resulted in many deaths over the world. And if they don't correct this or rectify this, obviously they will not get any corporations from all the countries that are supporting it. So I think this issue, let's walk away from Trump and let's look at the fact that this WHO, led by Mr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, is actually very corrupt in its skewage toward China. And that, I think, is an argumental issue that we should be focused on.
Sager, on what basis do you make that claim? Do you have any proof for that?
There's far too many, but we can just talk about the most acute example of it. For example, on January 30th, which has already been easily over 2 weeks after there's been a warning from the Taiwanese. Now, Taiwan is certainly another good window to argue about this, where this WHO is so skewed to China. But on January 30th, I remember that WHO finally came up with a public health emergency, but it's far too late. By then, Australia, India, Indonesia, Italy, and US were imposing restriction on travel to and from China, where Tedros clearly said that this only increases fear and stigma with little public health benefit. And on the other hand, at the same conference, he was praising the President Xi Jinping for very, very leadership and China's transparency, which dropped everybody's jaw. The Japanese ex-prime minister, vice minister right now, Mr. Aso, even he said that this isn't WHO, it's CHO, China Health Organization.
Okay.
This is one of the various issues, along with this problem of Taiwan, is a very clear indication that he and his colleagues are extremely skewed, which is extremely dangerous for us all in the world.
Okay, now from Bristol, let me bring in Tony Gosling, investigative journalist. Good to have you with us, Tony. In response to U.S. threats, WHO member states have adopted a resolution in order to launch an independent and comprehensive evaluation of the global response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Is this fair enough? Would the U.S. cooperate so that its allegations of the UN body's missteps are clarified?
Well, it all depends on who's in charge of this investigation, doesn't it? I mean, we're in a very peculiar situation now around the world, where many international bodies, very different sorts of bodies, including things like the International Olympic Committee, the Athletics Federation, these kinds of people, even the chemical weapons people, there is a battle for control of these organisations, and the World Health Organization is one of those. I mean, the idea that this is something which is China's fault, I think, is actually laughable. And of course, it's quite clear that the administration, Donald Trump included, are being sort of tricked really into using them as a scapegoat for the problems at home. Now, obviously, this is a very nasty disease. It's killing many, many people. But the idea that this is somehow someone else's fault, they've got to point their finger around the world, I'm afraid is pretty much infantile. There is a big debate to be had about the idea of a vaccine and whether that is actually going to be the solution to this, because we know that flu vaccines, for example, after a year become useless. You have to have another type of flu vaccine because the flu virus mutates, so you need another one. So everyone seems to be, or many people in the West anyway, putting their eggs all in one basket, saying, oh, we're going to have a vaccine. But at the end of the day, they haven't thought it through, have they? Because it certainly looks as if they won't have a vaccine until a year after the pandemic is coming to an end, or at least the major part of it. Mm-hmm. So I think we need a debate about these vaccines and viruses. And it's a debate in the West which has been suppressed really for at least the last decade as to whether vaccines are really as good as they're cracked up to be. Back in the 1980s in the United States, there was a law passed that meant that nobody who was actually injured by a vaccine could sue the vaccine manufacturer, that they would have to sue the government instead. And so there has been a very strong lobby of people who have been injured by vaccines, or believe they have, who are saying, well, no, we should be able to sue the manufacturers of this vaccine. So that's where we are now, is that Big Pharma has got into a position where it wants to mandate vaccines in different parts of the world. It's already quite a long way down that road in Germany. And of course, they stand to make an absolute fortune out of this. This is the problem with the profit motive, is it doesn't really suit itself to something like healthcare, because it doesn't suit big companies to cure people. They want to get people dependent on their injections and on their treatments. And so there needs to be a proper debate about this. The idea that the World Health Organization in an investigation is going to be able to do this, I'm afraid it's not very feasible unless it's done in a proper, transparent manner. You have to look at where the funding is coming from the World Health Organization, which over the last, let's think, 12 years since the 2008 financial crisis has been largely funded by private interests now. The UN has had all sorts of trouble getting its money from America. Trump has now pulled the plug on the finances, and he's saying he's going to do it possibly permanently. Well, this will effectively leave the World Health Organization in the hands of other countries and, of course, the US pharmaceutical industry. So they will find whatever it is they want in any possible future investigation. What we really need is these organizations to be open and accountable rather than privately funded. That's the way I see the World Health Organization. It's afraid it's been compromised over the years. But having said that, Trump is absolutely wrong to blame the Chinese. And I think that is the one take home from this.
I'm going to put that question to Seijiro. Okay, let me go to Japan. Seijiro, speaking of the Chinese perspective, this Beijing is accusing the Trump administration of pointing fingers at others in order to distract the public from its own mishandling of the coronavirus at home. I don't think you agree with that, do you?
I totally disagree in many sense. Now, it's very clear that China is putting a PR offensive. If you really look back, a step back, this is obviously a fight over hegemony on the health issues. It's very clear that China has been increasing its economic presence, and now they're trying to get the financial side, and they're also going for the health side. And obviously, U.S. is trying to stop that. That is the basic foundation of the argument that's been going on. But as the gentleman has been arguing, I agree totally with the fact that WHO should be a transparent institution, which should be targeting to tackle this worldwide phenomena. But unfortunately, WHO is not. And they are definitely, especially the top leaders, including the likes of, Dr. Tedros or Bruce Aylward, who is the Assistant Director General of WHO, who is so skewed excessively towards this one China principle and introducing the politics and policies and reflecting that to their management, which again should not be the case. It should be a clear, neutral third party, which should be administering and managing, this risk. But if you look at it from any angle, again, as I said, we could talk all morning about this. But it's extremely clear. If you, for example, look at their comments toward Taiwan, which they're trying to avoid at all costs, which is a totally different methodology that was adopted by, for example, Dr. Brundtland, who was also the General Secretary when SARS epidemic broke out. So if you make that comparative analysis of how WHO reacted during SARS versus this time, it becomes crystal clear that they're being extremely influenced by this, the Chinese principle. And that, I think, would be a very dangerous and gloomy forecast. Because, as the gentleman was saying, America will be playing out. It's not only America, it's all the allies, Western allies that are associated, that will probably prolong has anxiety towards the actions of WHO.
Right. Now, Tony, I want to ask you a question regarding what the job of WHO is in all of this. Because both Washington and Beijing, and maybe some others also, say Juro mentioned also Australia and others, they're also blaming WHO. I mean, China did announce the pandemic. It started taking action, so did other parts of the world, and also the US. So why is everybody blaming WHO for this?
Question. We had here in Britain the Daily Mirror, one of our national newspapers, on Friday, say that they believe that 19 million people in Britain have had COVID-19. So it does seem rather silly to try and stop it spreading, since coming on for a third of the nation has had it and got through it. I mean, yes, obviously those who are vulnerable need to be stopped spreading to them. I think the role of the World Health Organization, at the moment, we're in a turning point, aren't we? There is an enormous pressure on international institutions to be fair, to prevent a third world war. The United States is falling out in a big way with China through trade. It's possible the US may just simply say we're not paying any of the debt that they owe to China, which is going to be almost like a time bomb going off. There's also all the tensions that we've got going on in the Middle East. We had the death of the Chinese ambassador to Israel the other day, which hardly got a mention here, but there are certain suspicions about that, with China has taken a very strong position on Palestine, saying that they believe that East Jerusalem should be the capital of Palestine. So, there are potential tensions growing and growing. The World Health Organization has got to get a grip. It's got to be decisive, and it's got to lead the world through this maze, through the trees of this awful virus. The way they could do that, and I would just recommend right now, this is what they should be doing today, they should organize a global television program which would be a debate over the virus between Bill Gates, who has put a tremendous amount of money into all of the reaction to it, the lockdown sort of thing, and Andrew Wakefield, who is a doctor who has been pilloried over the years, but he's a big critic of vaccines, and he has his own idea about how these things should be responded. These are the two big figures in the world.
Okay.
And we haven't really seen any kind of discussion between these two figures over what is essentially an issue about viruses and vaccines. And I think that World Health Organization will get a tremendous amount of respect if the world could see just what a mess much of our Western media has made of this discussion and this debate, and allow some of the top key people in the world to debate it in public. I think then the public would be able to make their own minds rather than these institutions.
Now, Sajur, let me ask you this. When it comes to performance and actual response to this pandemic, you see that countries like Taiwan, Singapore, they've been much more successful than the U.S. has been. Why is that?
Absolutely. I mean, Taiwan and New Zealand are the two countries, but particularly, Taiwan, they even warned the WHO back in January 14th that this is a human-to-human transmission, which, again, WHO totally ignored for the political reasons that it came from, Taiwan. And the Taiwanese and many other countries which have been successful are rather countries with a relatively small size, with fast information, with a lot of proactive actions by the politicians, top-down decision-making process, with a lot of, I would say, cohesiveness in the community, which basically contributed to, making this, pandemic a much smaller effect to their nation. And I do also believe that, they were not really swayed too much by this, political motives of both the United States and China. It's not only the U.S. that's in a desperate situation, it's also China as well. Let's not forget that you got the Hong Kong democracy movement that went on in November, in Taiwan in January. It was an overwhelming victory for anti-Chinese, Tsai Ing-wen. And you've got their internal problems. So, you have a lot of issues on China as well.
I got to jump
but they
in. We
weren't
have only
really affected
1 minute
on that.
left. Sorry, we just have 1 minute. Tony, I got one last question for you. Chinese president has announced plans to donate $2 billion to fight the coronavirus. They're dispatching medical staff to Africa and elsewhere. This is twice as much as the U.S. gave the WHO before the U.S. cut off funds. Let's have your comments. 1 minute only.
China has shown a far better, more responsible approach around the world. In fact, it's done the job a little bit like Russia has done in Syria for the UN on COVID-19. They've sent these teams around the world to Italy, etc., helping those countries. We haven't seen that from the United States. But it's interesting that Donald Trump has now admitted to taking hydroxychloroquine, which is a malarial drug. Now, there is a medical reason why he might have done that, and that is because one of the things we're seeing with this virus is a very different reaction. It's not like normal pneumonia. People have been getting what they call a cytokine storm, which is an overreaction of the immune system. And it would make sense to take hydroxychloroquine if this was the real problem, because this suppresses the immune system. People can possibly survive it. Survive this cytokine storm after taking this. This does also allow us to wonder, was this a man-made virus? Because this is a coronavirus which is for the common cold, but it doesn't behave like that. The Delhi University has said that had more extra aspects to it, like AIDS and SARS inside it. So this is something which definitely needs investigating in the future.
I have to jump in, sorry. That's all the time we have. Let me thank our guests. We had Professor of the University of Shizuoka, Takeshita Seijiro, who joined us from Shizuoka, and also investigative journalist Tony Gosling out of Bristol. Thank you for watching this debate. I'll see you next time.